The inventory listed everything: the ironwork in the East Gallery, the Flemish tapestry in the upper hall, the oak writing desk that had belonged to her grandfather, the cellar, 42 bottles of claret and 17 of port, the stables, the kitchen garden, the gatehouse, the sundial her mother had ordered from a craftsman in Bath and never lived to see installed, and then, near the bottom of the second page, in the same measured hand as everything else, one dependent, female, age approximately 22, currently residing in the East Wing, status unclear. That was how Thornwick Manor changed hands. That was how Genevieve Castlereagh, daughter of the 5th Earl of Mourne, raised in those very rooms, baptized in the chapel at the end of the South Drive, became a line item between a broken clock and a disputed set of silver candlesticks. She read it standing in the hallway, the solicitor's copy having been left on the side table by someone who either didn't know she would find it or didn't particularly care. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its existing crease and set it back exactly where she had found it, and walked to the kitchen to ask Mrs. Dunbar whether there was any tea. There was tea. There was always tea. It was perhaps the one reliable thing left. Her father had died in November. The illness had come quickly, or rather, it had been coming quietly for years, and then arrived all at once in the way of things that have been patient for too long. By the time Genevieve understood what was happening, he was already past explaining himself. He had pressed her hand and looked at the ceiling and said, once, very clearly, "I am sorry, my girl." She hadn't known what he meant. She had assumed he meant the illness. She had assumed, as she had always been inclined to assume, that the complicated parts would resolve themselves in time. They did not resolve themselves. The solicitor, a Mr. Featherstone, dry and precise as old paper, had come to Thornwick 3 days after the funeral. He had sat across from her in the withdrawing room and had explained, in careful, unhurried language, that her father had borrowed against the estate some years prior, that the borrowing had continued, that the estate, including the house, the grounds, the tenant farms, and all contents therein, had been offered as surety against debts that had not been repaid, that the creditor, a man named Delmere, whose name she did not know and whose face she had never seen, had called in those debts 6 months before her father died. The estate had, legally, already changed hands before he was buried. He had written her a letter. Mr. Featherstone produced it from his case with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he has delivered before. She had taken it and not opened it in front of him, and he had understood this and had left. She opened it that evening, alone in her father's study, in the chair he had always sat in. It was 4 pages. He wrote in his usual way, long sentences, side thoughts, the occasional Latin phrase he couldn't resist. He told her about the debts. He told her how they had started, a bad season, a failed investment, a loan taken to bridge what he believed would be a temporary difficulty, and then another, and then another. He told her that he had tried, in the final year, to rectify things, that he had made arrangements, that Thornwick was to pass to a man named Radley, a cousin of the creditor's, a man he had met once and found to be, in his own phrase, not obviously cruel. He asked her forgiveness. He asked it plainly, without ornamentation. He said he did not expect it. He told her that he had had the family solicitor draw up a document, separate from the sale, hidden in the estate records in the muniment room, behind the ledgers from 1798, which acknowledged Genevieve formally as his daughter and legitimate heir, and which stated that her right to bear the name Castlereagh could not be bought or sold with any property. He told her he was sorry he had not been braver, sooner. She sat with the letter for a long time. The fire went out. She didn't rebuild it. In the weeks that followed, Genevieve did not leave. This was, she understood, irregular. The new owner had not yet arrived. The staff, Mrs. Dunbar the housekeeper, Tate the groundskeeper, 3 kitchen girls, and an elderly coachman named Horace, who had been at Thornwick longer than anyone could accurately remember, were in a state of suspended uncertainty. They moved through the house quietly, as if noise might attract a decision. Genevieve moved through it the same way she always had, which was perhaps the strangest thing of all. She knew every room. She knew which floorboards spoke and which stairs creaked on the left side. She knew that the window latch in the library didn't catch properly unless you lifted it at a slight angle, and that the apple tree in the kitchen garden produced nothing useful but had the best climbing branches of any tree on the property, a fact she had verified personally at age 9. She could not imagine leaving, so she told Mrs. Dunbar, who had known her since she was 4 years old and whose expression, upon hearing the plan, could be described as the face of a woman choosing, very deliberately, not to say what she was thinking, that she intended to remain on as part of the household staff until the new owner arrived and could be made to understand the situation. "And if he doesn't wish to understand the situation?" Mrs. Dunbar asked. "Then I'll have a clearer picture of who he is," Genevieve said. It was not, she knew, a plan. It was barely even a strategy. But it was what she had, and so she put on the dress she wore when she helped with the linen inventory, and she went and helped with the linen inventory, and she learned, without particularly intending to, that she was surprisingly good at making herself invisible in a house she had lived in her entire life. The new owner arrived on a Tuesday in February with a traveling carriage, 2 outriders, a valet, and the particular manner of a man who is used to walking into rooms and having them rearrange themselves around him. His name, Mr. Featherstone had mentioned in passing, was Cassian Windermere. He was the 6th Earl of something she hadn't caught, and he had purchased Thornwick along with its debts and its contents, and, apparently, its unclear female dependent from the creditor Delmere, who had presumably been delighted to be rid of the whole complicated matter. Genevieve watched him arrive from an upstairs window. He was younger than she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something older, something banker-ish, something that looked more like a line of credit. He was tall, and he stood in the drive looking up at the house for a long moment before going in, the way people sometimes did when they were genuinely trying to understand something rather than simply cataloging it. She found this, against her will, slightly encouraging. He noticed her on the second day. She had been carrying a stack of linen from the storage cupboard to the east corridor, and had turned the corner at the top of the stairs to find he's standing in the portrait gallery, looking at the paintings. He had a small notebook open and was writing something in it, and he looked up when she appeared, and they regarded each other with the mutual startlement of 2 people who had each believed themselves to be alone. "You must be the dependent," he said. Then he seemed to hear himself and added, "I apologize. That is not how I intended to begin. I expect it's what's written in the inventory," Genevieve said. "It is." He looked at the notebook, then at her. "It doesn't tell me much. What is your role here?" This was the moment she had been preparing for, more or less, and yet, hearing the question directly, she found that the prepared answer, "I assist with the household management, my lord," sat oddly in her throat. She said it anyway. He nodded, but he kept looking at her with the expression of a man who is aware he has not been told the whole truth, and is deciding how much to press the matter. "What is your name?" he asked. She had thought about this too. She said, "Genevieve, my lord, and your surname?" A pause that lasted perhaps a half-second too long. "I am generally called simply Genevieve, my lord." He wrote something in his notebook. She could not see what. "Very well," he said. "Genevieve, I'd like to understand the household arrangements by the end of the week. Would you be willing to walk me through the estate?" She said she would. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying to determine what, exactly, she had agreed to. She walked him through it over 3 days. The house first, the state of the roof in the north wing, 2 sections needed attention before spring. The library, the shelves along the south wall, were bowing and would need to be reinforced. The chapel, sound but cold. The heating system having been a source of ongoing argument between her father and every builder he had ever hired. Then the grounds, the tenant farms, the kitchen garden, the stables where a large and extremely opinionated horse named Ptolemy had lived for 14 years and showed every sign of continuing to do so indefinitely. Cassian Windmere listened. He asked questions, good questions. She found herself thinking, against her inclination, questions that showed he had actually been paying attention, that he understood what he was looking at. He wrote things in his notebook. He did not at any point ask why she knew so much about a house she supposedly worked in, though she could see, sometimes, that the question was there. On the 3rd afternoon they came back through the kitchen garden in the gray February light, and he stopped at the sundial her mother had ordered from the craftsman in Bath. "This is recent," he said, "relative to the rest of the estate. It was installed 10 years ago," Genevieve said. "It was a particular. It mattered to the previous family." He looked at it for a moment. "The late Earl's family, yes. He had a daughter," Cassian said. "It's mentioned in the estate records. She would be about your age, I suppose." Genevieve said nothing. He looked at her steadily. He had very direct eyes, she had noticed, gray and slightly disconcerting in the way of eyes that seemed to be doing more work than strictly necessary. "I'm not going to ask you to say anything you're not ready to say," he said. "But I'd ask you not to take me for a fool either." She stood there in the kitchen garden of the house she had grown up in, her hands cold in their gloves, the sundial catching the thin winter light, and she tried to find a reasonable response. "The letter," she said finally. "There is a letter, in the muniment room, behind the 1798 ledgers. My father, the late Earl, had his solicitor draw it up before he died. It explains everything more clearly than I can." He did not say anything for a moment. "Then, show me." They went to the muniment room together. She found the ledgers. She knew exactly where they were, had known since her father described them, and behind the 3rd volume, tied with a piece of faded green ribbon, was a slim packet of folded papers. She handed them to him, and he read them there, standing, in the gray light from the high narrow window. She watched his face as he read. He was the kind of person whose face did not give away a great deal, but she caught the moment when he understood what he was holding, because something shifted very slightly in the set of his jaw. He read to the end. Then he lowered the papers and looked at her. "Your father acknowledged you as his legitimate heir," he said. "Legally, in writing. Before the estate was transferred, yes, and yet you've been here for 3 months pretending to be," she said. "Unclear. I believe the inventory described me as status unclear." He stared at her. Something moved across his face that she could not quite interpret. Not amusement, exactly, but something adjacent to it, and something that might have been a kind of cautious respect. "Why?" he asked. "Why not simply tell Featherstone?" "Why not?" "Because Featherstone works for the creditor. Because everything my father owned was gone before he died. Because the letter says I have a right to my name, but a name is not a house, and I—" She stopped. The thing was that she had not expected to care so much about the house. She had thought, in the weeks after her father died, that she was practical enough, clear-eyed enough, to understand that Thornwick was lost, and that understanding it fully was the same as releasing it. But every morning she woke up in the east wing and heard the sounds of the house, and she could not make herself go. "I wanted to understand," she said, "what you would do with it before I had to leave." He stood very still. "You were going to leave?" he said. "Once you'd decided?" "I wasn't going to stay indefinitely under false pretenses." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the papers in his hand. "These were drawn up legally?" "By Mr. Featherstone's predecessor, who was not employed by the creditor. Then they can be filed. He said this in the voice of a man thinking out loud rather than speaking to her. Your legitimacy can be formally registered. Your name, your right to it, is documentable. Yes. He folded the papers carefully and held them for a moment, and then he held them out to her. Keep these, he said. They're yours. She did not expect things to proceed as they did. She expected a conversation with a solicitor. She expected a formal, somewhat stiff resolution in which her status would be clarified, and she would be thanked for her patience and given some reasonable provision, and she would take her name and her father's letter and find somewhere to go. She did not expect Cassian Windmere to spend the following week going methodically through every piece of estate documentation he could find. She did not expect him to call his own solicitor up from London, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Aldwick, and instruct her to find every possible ground on which the letter could be given legal force. She did not expect, either, the visit from a man named Harwick Crane. He arrived on a Thursday without an invitation, with a solicitor of his own and the particular confidence of a man who believes he holds something valuable. He was a second cousin of the previous creditor, and he explained in the front hall, with the air of someone delivering good news to himself, discovered a prior claim. Genevieve heard this from the library, where she had been cataloging, very slowly, the books her father had loved. She came into the hall because she heard her own name. Harwick Crane looked at her the way people sometimes look at objects that have moved from where they expected to find them. You are the dependent, he said. I am Genevieve Castlereagh, she said, daughter of the 5th Earl of Mourne. He smiled, which she did not find reassuring. Yes, he said, about that. The prior claim. There is no prior claim, Cassian said. He had come from the direction of his study, and he spoke without raising his voice, which was somehow more final than shouting would have been. He stood beside Genevieve with the easy certainty of a man who has already done the work and is simply reporting its results. Harwick Crane began to explain the prior claim. His solicitor produced documents. Cassian's solicitor, Mrs. Aldwick, who had been sitting in the drawing room with a cup of tea, and the patience of a person who has seen this before, came and stood on Genevieve's other side. She produced other documents. It took some time. Genevieve found, partway through, that she had stopped being afraid. There was something in being flanked by these two people, one of whom had known her since she was an infant, and one of whom had known her for 11 days. That made the whole performance of Harwick Crane and his solicitor seem somewhat less consequential than it had appeared. He left, eventually. His solicitor left. The door closed. Mrs. Aldwick went back to her tea. Cassian looked at Genevieve. He'll try again, he said. Through other channels, I know. The strongest protection would be to have your status formally registered and publicly acknowledged. I understand. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the branches of the oak trees along the drive. Genevieve had known those trees since she could see out of windows. She knew what they sounded like in February specifically, which was different from how they sounded in other months. There is, Cassian said, very carefully, another protection, more permanent, less dependent on the goodwill of solicitors and record offices. She looked at him. I am aware, he said, that we have known each other less than a fortnight. I am aware that this house is complicated ground between us, and that I am not in a position to ask for anything you don't wish to give. But if you wanted, if it seemed to you a reasonable solution, it would be considerably more difficult for a man like Harwick Crane to contest the standing of the Countess of Thornwick than the standing of a woman with a letter behind a ledger. She looked at him for a long time. You are asking me to marry you, she said. I am telling you that the option exists, he said. If you want it, there is no pressure in either direction. You have known me for 11 days. 12, he said. As of this morning. She looked away, at the oak trees through the window, at the winter light lying flat across the drive. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about the sundial in the kitchen garden. She thought about Ptolemy the horse, who had bitten 2 of the grooms and shown absolutely no remorse about it, and whom she had been the only person to reliably manage for the past 4 years. "I will think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. She thought about it for 6 days. She thought about it while cataloging the library, and while walking the grounds with Tate, and while sitting in the kitchen with Mrs. Dunbar, who was pointedly not offering her opinion, but whose whole manner conveyed that she had one. She thought about what it meant that he had handed her back the letter. She thought about the notebook with its careful questions. She thought about the way he had stood beside her in the hall when Harwick Crane arrived, without fanfare, as if it were simply the obvious place to stand. She thought about her father's letter and the last line of it, which she had read many times now. "I hope you will find someone who sees what you are without needing you to explain it. I was not always good at that myself. I should have been better." On the 6th day, she went and found Cassian in his study, where he was reading correspondence with the slightly pained expression of a man who receives more letters than he would prefer. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "To the question," she said, "the one you asked, or described, or whatever that was." "It was a proposal," he said, "somewhat cautiously delivered, I admit." "Yes," she said again, "if you still mean it." He stood up. "I still mean it," he said, unambiguously. She nodded. She looked around the room, her father's room, which had been rearranged now to suit someone else's way of working, which was strange and also, somehow, all right. Things changed. Rooms became other rooms. People came and went through the same doors for different reasons, and the house held all of it. "There's something you should know," she said, "about Ptolemy." He waited. "He bites," she said. "He has always bitten. He will continue to bite. He is very old and has strong opinions, and I am telling you this now because it seems honest." Cassian regarded her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was a form of amusement that presented itself as seriousness. "I have been informed," he said. "Be everyone I have spoken to since Tuesday. The horse is apparently legendary." "He is," she said. "He was my mother's." A pause, quiet and particular. "Then we'll keep him," Cassian said. They were married in the Thornwick Chapel at the end of March. The heating was still insufficient, a problem that Mrs. Aldwick added to a running list of structural priorities she had developed with what seemed like genuine personal investment. The oak trees along the drive were beginning, very tentatively, to consider the possibility of leaves. The kitchen garden smelled of cold earth and the first cautious herbs. Genevieve wore the dress her mother had been married in, which Mrs. Dunbar had kept in the cedar chest in the attic with a proprietary care that implied she had always suspected it would be needed again. Harwick Crane sent a letter through his solicitor 3 weeks after the wedding. Mrs. Aldwick responded. The letter was not answered again. The muniment room was reorganized in the spring. The ledgers properly cataloged for the first time. In a generation, the letter filed in the correct location and cross-referenced in the estate records. Mr. Featherstone, upon being shown the documentation, had the expression of a man regretting several professional decisions in sequence. Genevieve walked the estate every morning, the same route she had always walked, the same stones and hedgerows, and the pond that froze badly in January and thawed reluctantly in March. Cassian began to walk it with her, at first out of practicality. He was still learning the land. And then, she thought, out of something else. He listened well. He asked good questions. He had the patience of a man who understood that understanding things properly takes longer than it is sometimes convenient to admit. In May, Ptolemy bid a visiting solicitor from Edinburgh and showed, as was his established custom, absolutely no remorse. Genevieve gave him an apple from the kitchen garden, apple tree, and told him he was insufferable. He accepted the apple with dignity and looked out over the grounds with the serene authority of an elderly creature who has outlasted everything that has tried to manage him. The sundial caught the morning light. The estate stood as it had always stood. Things had changed and things had held, and the difference between the two was, she found, less absolute than she had once believed. She was home. She had, it turned out, never quite left.